I remember when I heard about Parasite Eve coming to the PlayStation when I was younger. Just a year prior, in 1997, my whole childhood was flipped upside down when I played Final Fantasy VII. It was a game that would forever change my life in ways that I wouldn't even imagine at the time. So seeing another RPG on the horizon from Squaresoft, I immediately started saving up my money again in anticipation for another great RPG experience. And while it may have been a little naive of me to think that Parasite Eve would even come close to the amazing game that Final Fantasy VII was, I was not that disappointed when it came time to join Aya Brea on her quest to save the world. So whether you're someone who's played this game before, or are just curious about what you might be getting yourself into, let's take a journey into Squaresoft's first M-rated game, their 1998 cinematic RPG, Parasite Eve. I was about 14 or 15 years old when I got my hands on Parasite Eve for the first time. It wasn't until about 20 years later that I'd find out that this game was actually a sequel to a Japanese novel of the same name. Written by Hideki Senna in 1995, the novel was eventually published in English here in North America in 2005. In the interest of keeping this retro review spoiler-free, I'm not going to go into the details of the novel itself. However, there are times in this game that the characters refer to the incident in Japan. They're actually referring to the events of this novel. The novel isn't required reading though, you don't need to read it to understand what's going on, so no worries on that front. I would love to get my hands on it eventually though, but after a quick internet search, I may have to settle for the Kindle version. So back to the game itself. Parasite Eve stars Detective Aya Brea of the NYPD. She's a headstrong, take-charge type of person whose personality shows very early on in the opening scene of the game. After a brief introduction to Aya, you get to choose a new first name for her if you so choose, which is a nice touch if you're into that sort of thing. I remember when I was younger and played the game through a few times, I used to name Aya after different girls I knew in school. Because that's what 14-year-old gamer boys back in the 90s with huge crushes on girls and virtually no self-confidence did. Anyway, in the opening scene, we're introduced to the game's antagonist, Eve, who has taken possession of an opera singer via her mitochondria, the microscopic organisms that give cells energy to function in our bodies. Aya and Eve are bonded by their mitochondria, and as the game opens, it's evident that this bond will set the stage for the story to come. In one of the best video game openings of all time, Eve announces her presence to the world by setting everyone around her on literal fire. And it's here where Aya immediately stands out to me as a fantastic character. Not only does she come strapped to the opera, she has zero time for nonsense. Aya doesn't think twice before heading to the stage to confront this strange threat, despite people bursting into flames all around her. In the game's opening battle, Aya's own mitochondria seem to awaken, giving her abilities that continue to grow and evolve along with Eve. What's more, Aya seems impervious to Eve's ability to spontaneously combust anyone who gets near her. As Eve continues to evolve into a monster and spawns creatures all around her, it's up to Aya to figure out their connection and prevent the world from being taken over by Eve and her mitochondria. As the story rages on, Aya starts to wonder what it all means and if it's possible that she might be just as much of a monster as her foe. Aya doesn't fight alone, however, as she has a great supporting cast to support her throughout her journey, and I think this is where a big part of the game kind of stuck with me over the years when it came to the game's story. Aya's partner Daniel serves as the warm, caring, and often brash big brother type who's just trying to be a good father to his son. Daniel very much plays the role of Aya's protector who shares a very similar aversion to nonsense. A little later in the story, we meet Kunohiko Maeda, a scientist from Japan who specializes in mitochondria. He was around for the incident in Japan, and once he gets word of similar happenings in New York, heads right on over to see things for himself. His personality is very much in contrast to Aya and Daniel. He's shy, soft-spoken, and often doesn't get a chance to say much, although his support and understanding of the situation might be what turned the tide in our heroine's favor. He also likes to give Aya good luck charms that, to this day, no one can really seem to figure out exactly what they do, other than take up inventory space. But hey, it's the thought that counts. Parasite Eve does a decent job of pacing when it comes to the overall storytelling of the main plot. The story unfolds utilizing dialogue text as well as some CGI cutscenes that were pretty impressive for the time. The CGI scenes fit into the gameplay fairly seamlessly and, along with the amazing soundtrack, which we'll get into a little bit later, give the game a cinematic feel in some spots. As you move through the story, you move to a location that's usually infested with monsters. As you make it through an area, more of the story unfolds and bits of the mystery around Aya, her past, and Eve are revealed, but only just enough to keep you wanting to push forward to put it all together. The story can be a little convoluted at times though. There are no supernatural elements here. Everything is explained by science, which can lead to some in-depth dialogue about genetics, cells, and other science speak. While the dialogue was done in such a way to keep even the worst science student engaged and able to follow the story, it wasn't until I played the game through a second time that most of the story really clicked for me. At this point in their development of games for the PlayStation, Squaresoft really nailed the presentation here. The 3D character and enemy models look pretty stunning for the time and look great as they move around the screen. Movement isn't super clunky or overly stiff, and the bad guys are wonderfully disgusting and equally as menacing. Aya, though, looks a little funky when she runs. Not only is her run speed a little slower than I think it should be, her run animation doesn't really seem to be in step with her movement speed. A minor gripe I only noted while really looking into the game for this review, but nothing that kills the experience by any means. Although we're going to talk about her movement speed and how it impacts gameplay a little later. The aforementioned CGI cutscenes in Parasite Eve almost always steal the show though, and not just for their graphic fidelity. For a game made in the late 90s, these scenes do a great job of joining some of the more prominent story set pieces together and really does help the game live up to that cinematic RPG tagline, especially near the game's conclusion. The pre-rendered backgrounds are really well done here, painting a great picture of all the locales, and the often tense soundtrack add a layer of tension and fear as you make your way through the dark corridors of Carnegie Hall, a snow-covered Central Park, and other places around New York. The soundtrack, which is composed by the now legendary Japanese video game composer Yoko Shimomura, are really what give Parasite Eve its identity. By design, the music on offer is very inorganic and a little empty sounding, almost isolating, but that's far from a knock on the music. As we take this journey with Aya and try to understand along with her this threat to humanity and how Aya herself fits into it all, Aya is thrown into a whirlwind of questions, self-doubt, and isolation. The piano pieces of the soundtrack are used to great effect and complement every music track they're present in, creating a haunting but soothing score. But when it's time for action and things get moving, the music also complement those segments. Battle music is catchy and upbeat, and it really gets your heart pumping. Yoko Shimomura even added opera vocalization on top of the piano tracks to some of the more prominent set pieces in the game, often used to symbolize Eve and her diabolical plans of mitochondrial takeover. You never would have thought something like this would work, but in Parasite Eve, I cannot imagine it done any other way. Aside from the incredible soundtrack, other little details add to the experience as well. Gunfire sounds pretty satisfying, and the sounds of footsteps in some areas will even change when walking over different surfaces. Your footsteps will echo on linoleum, crunch in the snow, and squish when you're walking over piles of goo. At times there isn't music playing at all, and you'll be hearing those footsteps quite a bit when you're moving around some spots in the game. But where the game does well with its soundtrack, it does just as well with its decision not to use it in some areas to emphasize a story moment or just create a thicker atmosphere. The gameplay in Parasite Eve is pretty straightforward. You control Aya as she traverses areas around Manhattan, such as the police precinct she works at, to Soho, to the Museum of Natural History. In some of the more dangerous areas, Aya can encounter enemies randomly when she travels over areas I like to think of as hotspots. When a battle commences, it takes place right there in the space that you're occupying, which means fights in narrow hallways or wide open spaces are possible. When enemies appear on screen, you'll mainly attack them with Aya's equipped weapon. However, after exposure to Eve in the opening moments of the game, Aya's own mitochondria have awakened, giving her access to parasite energy to use in battle. Think of these as magic spells you can cast. Parasite energy can be offensive or defensive. You can turn the tide of battle in your favor with an overpowered attack, inflict your enemy with a negative status, or increase your chances of survival by utilizing self-healing or other defensive buffs. While a battle happens in real time, you can only take an action with Aya when her ATB, active time bar, fills up completely. Until that happens, you can move Aya around in order to avoid enemy attacks. This is where Aya's slow movement speed translates into a little bit of an annoyance. While Aya moves at a decent clip, there are some enemy attacks you're more than likely going to be hit by unless you're already far enough away from them before they start to wind up. I would find myself taking hits from enemies only because Aya moved too slow to get out of the way. This really stood out for me against some of the later game enemies, and while this didn't happen too often enough, it happened just enough to generate a few eye rolls as I watched my health deplete in a fight with a lower level enemy. When it's time for action and the ATB fills, Aya can take an action either by firing her weapon or using her parasite energy. When you start to select a command, time actually stops, allowing you to think through your next move. When you're using a firearm, a green dome opens around Aya to show you the range of your currently equipped weapon. If you target an enemy inside the dome, you'll generally hit your target for the full amount of damage that your weapon is supposed to deal. However, if you target an enemy outside the dome, your chances of landing a hit decrease drastically, and if you do manage to land a hit, it won't be anywhere near the full attack power of your weapon. It's a fairly simple yet addicting mechanic. You're always balancing your distance to the enemy while keeping in mind your own combat effectiveness when you're able to act. Aside from Aya's movement speed, I did have one more gripe about the combat. In battle, unless you're counting how many bullets you fired, you have no way to know when Aya's weapon is going to run out of ammo until the last shot in the weapon's magazine is fired, at which point Aya will stop what she's doing and reload, during which you cannot move her until the reload is complete, and if reloading is finished and Aya still has a command to perform, she'll automatically continue to that next command. This can potentially lock Aya in one place for a very long time if you're not prepared, opening her up to some free hits by the enemy. The only way to reload your weapon manually is through the menu, which you cannot access in battle. It's an odd feature, one that is completely immersion breaking for a game that has such heavy emphasis on its firearm-based combat. But don't let this criticism sour the experience for you. Really, this doesn't happen too terribly often, and as you upgrade the capacity of your favorite weapon, this almost becomes a non-factor in the late game. As you defeat monsters and win battles, you gain experience points. Get enough, and Aya levels up, becoming stronger. As you level up, Aya gains more parasite abilities to use in battle, different healing spells, offensive skills, etc. When you level up, you also get bonus points which you can use to increase a few of Aya's stats even further, or use them to upgrade a weapon or a piece of armor. Speaking of upgrading weapons and armor, Parasite Eve also has a somewhat deep weapon and armor upgrading system. Using tools, you can transfer stats from one weapon to another, effectively making them stronger. Some weapons and armor even have abilities you can utilize or transfer, such as giving you the ability to shoot bullets that can poison your enemies, allow you to take 2 turns in rapid succession, or even automatically using a healing item before taking lethal damage. Part of what makes Parasite Eve enjoyable is being on the lookout for new equipment to give yourself that much needed edge. But there is an element of risk involved. Once you move a stat or ability off a weapon, that weapon is scrapped and lost forever, so you have to think carefully about the moves you want to make. I will say though, there's nothing more satisfying than settling on a weapon and slowly tweaking it with other weapons you find, making it more and more powerful. It serves to create a truly unique experience for the player. There are multiple weapon types to choose from as well: pistols, rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, and grenade launchers. On a weapon, the 3 major stats are attack, range, and bullets, which is the capacity of a weapon before having to reload. Even with the upgrading system though, I wish the weapons had more than just 3 major stats to help make the weapon types a little bit more unique in combat. Some of the weapon types do have built-in benefits and drawbacks that you won't notice until you try them. Handguns are great all-around weapons with a decent fire rate, fast reload time, and often have a higher critical hit rate. Shotguns are slow, but much more powerful and can hit multiple enemies. Rifles have incredible range and power, but are slow to fire each bullet, whereas submachine guns have very fast fire rates. The thing is, when you find a weapon type you do like, all that really matters is those 3 main stats and deciding on what advantages and drawbacks you want to work with given your chosen weapon. I personally favored handguns and very rarely found a reason to mess with any of the other weapon types as long as I had a good strong handgun in my inventory. The sheer variety of weapons just seemed to exist to be used to boost my one weapon. Sort of a letdown in my opinion, because I had no real reason to want to try anything different other than the 1 or 2 guns that I felt comfortable with. I will say, the joy I felt when finding a new weapon or armor piece did start to fade a little bit about halfway through the game as I settled on my preferred weapon and playstyle. Once you complete the game, you can save your game data and begin a new game called EX Mode, where you can play through the game again with a few twists. This game mode is a bit harder, and you also have access to a new location on the map called the Chrysler Building. It's a gauntlet of 77 floors, each filled with monsters of increasing difficulty, but it's also a location that has the best weapons and items in the game. More enticing is that you'll be rewarded with the game's true ending if you can conquer it. The items you have stored in the police station will be made available to you from your last playthrough, as well as your favorite weapon and armor, although the game doesn't really do a good job of explaining how this carries over. EX Mode gives you a great reason to play the game through again, although once you do complete it, you really don't have much of a reason to give the game another run unless you're wanting to keep powering up your preferred weapon or armor set. There's certainly an allure to this, but I never found it to be something I wanted to pursue. After EX Mode, Parasite Eve had already given me everything I wanted from its story, exploration, and its combat. Though with the inclusion of this game on the PlayStation Network, I found myself replaying this game now and again on my PlayStation Portable. Start to finish, this game would take me about 10 hours to complete, and probably an additional 12 hours to play through EX Mode and conquer the Chrysler Building. It's a special game to me, one that will always have a spot in my heart. It came to me when I was young and really made an impact on me as a person. You don't forget games that give you that kind of an experience. When you wrap it all up, Parasite Eve has a lot going for it, and it's one of the main reasons it continues to be one of my favorites after I've grown into adulthood. So let's break it down into my personal likes and dislikes. The game has a compelling and unique storyline, good graphical representation with its pre-rendered backgrounds, character models, and CGI cutscenes, and a memorable soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura that will stick with you well after your journey ends. Combat is simple, fun, and addictive. And at 10 or so hours to complete your first playthrough, it's not the type of RPG that requires you to sink tons of hours into it to get a good experience, which is perfect for a middle-aged adult with kids like myself. On the flip side, Aya's slow as molasses movement speed does make the exploration and backtracking a bit of a chore. Not knowing how many shots are left in your weapon is a little annoying too, especially when you run out and Aya forces a reload animation that you can't cancel out of. The inclusion of only 3 core customizable weapon and armor stats don't give me much incentive to try many of the other weapons or pieces of armor when I find them. Finally, when the EX mode is completed and you see the true ending, there really isn't much reason to play the game again. I did want more to do and more reasons to give the game another go, but sadly, there wasn't much left to achieve at that point. So, do I recommend Parasite Eve? Yes, I absolutely adore this game. If you can look past a few of its flaws, you're going to find a solid experience with Parasite Eve, and it's one that I highly recommend and think that every gamer should sit with at least once. There's no other game quite like Parasite Eve, and I am fairly confident there never will be again. At the time of posting this video, this game is available physically on the PlayStation if you can hunt down a physical copy, or digitally downloadable via the PlayStation Network, allowing you to play it on your PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, or the PlayStation Vita. Well, that does it for my thoughts on Parasite Eve. There are 2 more games in the series that I'll be reviewing in the near future. Will Parasite Eve 2 hit all the same marks for me? What about the game that came out on the PlayStation Portable, The Third Birthday? While I'm sure the majority of you all have your own opinions and feelings about these follow-ups, I'd be absolutely honored if you join me when I share with you my own. If you like this video, consider hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel. As I continue to grow this project of reviewing and talking about the games that I love, it'd be awesome for you to take this journey with me and share your own thoughts and stories about your own gaming experiences. Until then, thank you for spending your time with me, and I'll see you next time as we add another chapter to Nomad's Retro Reviews.